So nobody warned me that on the other side of training, I'd feel like an alien in the place that I had called home. And nobody warned me that I may fall subject to the dark side of the industry. Nobody prepared me to have tools presented as magic cure-alls to be weaponized against me. So if you've ever felt alone or alienated after returning home from training, please know that you're not alone. My name is Emily Dziedzic, and I'm a master coach and practitioner of NLP, timeline techniques, and hypnosis, as well as a trainer of these disciplines. And after all of this training, I can imagine that there are some of you who are also highly trained and have tuned into the presuppositions of language that I have used, and maybe thinking things like, yeah, but perception is projection, and that sounds an awful lot like being at the effect of things. It's thoughts like these that catapulted me into isolation after I came out of training, because believe me, I evaluated all of my thoughts and feelings against those filters. But let's backtrack for a bit and take a look at my journey into NLP, which started in March of 2020. So as you probably recall, the world turned on its head at that time. I came out of my practitioner training bubble and home to a world where I couldn't visit with my friends. I couldn't see clients in my office. And suddenly, I was faced with building a whole new business because my profession as a massage therapist had been shut down, all while also having just purchased my home 4 months prior. But I was motivated and I was excited. So I dove deep into all of the tools that I had at the ready between my practitioner training and building a business. And I put all of those efforts into building my coaching practice. I had been working with grieving women in my massage practice. So the most practical thing for me to do was to continue working with those women inside of the coaching space. And with the dangling carrot of more training as a motivator, I was determined to be financially successful in my practice. I loved the work and I was doing really well. So naturally, I had a desire for a deeper understanding of the material. I felt like this was the work that I had been seeking in the way of making changes in my own life and in the lives of those that I was fortunate enough to work with in my practice. So I returned to training a few months later to get my master practitioner credentials. And again, I was fully immersed in the work. I was grateful for the reprieve from lockdown procedures at home, and I was introduced to a whole new way of understanding about how our health is connected to the mind and body and our emotional experience. While I was at master practitioner training, trainer's training was pitched. And like many others, the excitement for more learning and the promise of a lucrative future drew me into those next levels. I leveraged my credit cards to make the training possible because, after all, I could make as much money as I wanted after training, so a small debt was a fair price for future success. But after 6 weeks of intensive training, which included the biggest breakdown and the biggest breakthrough that I had ever experienced, I went home to a world that was utterly unrecognizable. But really, perhaps it was simply I was unrecognizable to a world that hadn't changed much since I had been gone. The pandemic was still raging, and I struggled to relate to the fear that I was witnessing around me. I struggled in my friendships. I struggled to make sense of a world that didn't make sense anymore. And here I was with all of these tools. So, what was wrong with me? What else did I need to do to change my situation? What undiscovered limiting beliefs were still holding me back? I was determined to find answers to all of those questions, so I dove deep into learning and exploring and examining my life and my mind. I was just on this quest to learn everything I could about NLP, about language patterns, about myself, about what makes people tick. I did swish patterns and timeline techniques. I even hired a coach of my own, and yet I was still struggling. I was finding it a challenge to onboard new clients. Grief is a tricky niche, and many of the prospects that I had connected with weren't able or they weren't interested to invest a large sum of money in coaching in the midst of a pandemic. Plus, the methods and the techniques that I learned seemed most applicable and appropriate for concrete problems or for business issues. And grief is just the opposite of that. I worked with an incredibly tender population of women who had lost a child, and a 6 to 8 hour breakthrough was simply not enough. I found it a challenge to practice the way that I wanted to and felt like the way that my clients needed, while receiving feedback from mentors that if I couldn't do a breakthrough in the prescribed amount of time, then I needed to hone my skills. So it felt like the training and the tools had put me into a box that just didn't quite fit the work that I was doing. And once again, I decided it must be something inside of me that needed to be healed or needed to be resolved in order to find and serve the right clients. My perception needed to change. I needed to remain at cause. And yet, it felt like everything was falling apart around me at home. But because I was determined to remain at cause, I dove into the trainings as an assistant through a mentor's training business. I knew that if I wanted to be an exceptional coach and trainer, I needed to do the work. And since I didn't seem to relate to my community at home, I found solace in the NLP training world. I began to do contract work as I developed my skills, and I was desperate for community to escape the feeling like it all rested on me. And for a while, it was the antidote to the challenges that I was facing at home. The work that I was doing allowed me to travel. It allowed me to work with many clients and students, and it allowed me to build my skills and my confidence as a trainer. It finally felt like it all clicked until it didn't. In an attempt to do all that I could to deepen my knowledge, I tried to return to my training institute only to find out that I was no longer welcome to participate because I had sought training from someone who was deemed a competitor. So my quest to learn all that I could unknowingly removed myself from a community that was supposed to be supportive of my growth and development. And I didn't really have answers, so all I could do was assume that that rejection came from a scarcity mentality or from ego. So it seemed to me as if something was out of alignment, but I wasn't even sure what it was. And shortly thereafter, there were some things that were changing within the company that I was contracting for. And I had a strong opinion about those changes because I knew that they would have a ripple out effect on the company that wouldn't be undone or couldn't be undone. And it wouldn't have been a beneficial change for all parties involved. And rather than being met with curiosity as to why I felt the way that I did, I was met with resistance and blame. I was told repeatedly that if I had a problem, then it was my perception and it was my projection. It was my responsibility to fix my limiting beliefs and to stop being at the effect of everything so that I could make the changes required to remedy the organizational changes being made. I was told that I was uncoachable because my problems persisted. And learnings and growth that I had vulnerably shared became pointed jabs about my wounds that created the circumstances that I found myself in. So responsibility was displaced and shame entered in. So the tools and presuppositions of NLP that were once so supportive and comforting suddenly became a weapon that was being used against me. And so once again, I felt alone and confused. I gaslit my own experience by doing all that I could to examine myself, to take radical ownership and remedy a situation that wasn't even mine to remedy, all in the name of upholding the intentions of NLP, while those very same tools were being used against me. So, after much deliberation and heartache, I left the contract work and the training world altogether, and I returned to my practice. But after severe burnout and confusion and heartbreak, I was too depleted and betrayed to feel excited about the work. I gave a half-hearted attempt to run a group coaching program to help women achieve their goals, but it just wasn't sustainable for me. And once again, I went back to the examination of my limiting beliefs, of doing more timeline techniques, because there must be some unresolved emotions somewhere in me. Doing more submodality work, doing more belief changes, still while feeling alone and disconnected. I dove so deep into the NLP and coaching world only to be betrayed by people who came from the same training background that I had, by people who were more invested in financial gain than the human experience, who would rather use perception as projection as a weapon than take responsibility for their actions and reactions. And once again, I felt so isolated because I didn't know how to relate to people who hadn't gone through NLP training. I didn't know how to feel like a normal person anymore. I was left in the dust of despair that the very industry that was so exciting and supportive of my personal growth and development was also the industry that left me feeling completely and utterly alone and betrayed. And I just knew it was going to take a long time for that dust to settle. But fortunately, as life goes, I was introduced to a whole new world as I was fizzling out of coaching. And that world is the world of paramotors. If you're unfamiliar with paramotors, it's the sport where you have a motor on your back and a glider overhead and you run into the sky. Somewhere along the way, I had this vision of soaring through the air, feeling the freedom of flight. So I began to train to fly paramotors in 2022. And I was so grateful to have a new thing to learn that freed my mind from the weight of the previous 2 years, where I could show up as a regular person. And it was through flying that I returned to myself, where I found the space to process and heal. And it was a place where transformation didn't come through the form of an intensive breakthrough, but rather through enjoyment and flow and community. So I spent 2 years flying and running a paramotor flight school while fiercely rejecting the coaching world. Because for me, it was a place of darkness and pain. And I was on a quest to just be normal again, to feel like I could relate to people who had never touched the coaching world, to have conversations that didn't examine the presuppositions of language or feeling like I was holding people accountable for their actions and reactions. And this past fall, in my quest to return to myself, to heal, and to feel whole again, I stumbled across an NLP and hypnosis trainer who presented information in a way that I had never seen or heard before. Her approach was holistic, it was conversational, it had a somatic element, and it felt very feminine in its approach, which felt like such a stark contrast to the version of NLP that I learned, which was very masculine. It was very goal oriented and it was very success and financially focused. And this new approach felt emotionally aligned with the complexities of being human. All of a sudden, nothing was wrong with me. I was a complex human in a complex world, and that was okay. There was no facade of perfection. There were things that I could change that would improve my life, but my success was no longer framed around a structure of making X amount of money a month, or having a certain level of fame or notoriety, or having a magic wand for change. So I decided to jump into the next training that was offered, mostly for myself, but with the curiosity as to how it might impact my feelings about the coaching world. And through this new lens, I actually could start to make positive changes in my life. In a very short amount of time, things that had bothered me for years simply disappeared from my neurology. And to my delight, my spark for coaching came back. Melissa Tears is that instructor, and she's an incredible hypnotist and teacher. She weaves in the teachings of John Overdurf, Connie Ray Andreas, James Tripp, and many others. So rather than focusing on the founding fathers of NLP and creating a rigid structure of change work and a training framework, I got introduced to a whole new community of NLP geniuses who see the world similarly to how I see it. So suddenly and finally, I was able to approach clients with the open heart and full curiosity that I had hoped the coaching world would allow me to do. For so long, I had grappled with the original messaging that I was taught about what it meant if I was struggling. There was a complex equivalence built about how my struggles meant that I was doing something wrong, that I just needed to change my beliefs, or I just needed to reframe my experience, or I just needed to let go of those emotions. The tools were originally presented as these magical fixes. They were the remedy to life's ailments. And if the tools weren't working, then I wasn't working the tools. NLP was sold as the gateway to a perfect life where I could be happy and healthy and fulfilled and wealthy. And yet, through my experiences, I saw that the public face that sold that success also coexisted with the darkness behind the curtains. The tools and techniques that I learned back in 2020 were a solid foundation from which to build upon. But they were sold to me as the end all and be all of techniques. So when I felt like I was failing or that my clients had recurring problems, I was left at a loss. So it was through taking in ideas and new information and new perspective that allowed me to fill in the gaps so that I have tools that I need in the arena that I show up in, because it's not a one size fits all approach. Rather, it's a dynamic body of knowledge that we can leverage in ways that are unique to each one of us. So, through my journey back to NLP, I've come to realize and embrace that our struggles are part of our human experience. If we treat obstacles only as problems that need to be fixed, then the focus is on what's broken. And it's so easy to get caught up in that loop of constant change work without ever really living or enjoying the results that we've achieved. So for me, it's no longer about success metrics and about techniques to fix problems. It's about a holistic view of a person's very human experience and helping them towards change that allows them to become more connected and more congruent and more excited to do what they're meant to do. And if they get better at their jobs or strengthen their relationships or whatever other positive changes ripple out, then that's a beautiful bonus. I'm deeply grateful for the training and the experiences that I've had over the last 5 years, even for the challenging times, because that's allowed me to become the coach and the trainer that I am today. One who sees people for the beautiful complexity that they are, not as a problem to be fixed. So it's an honor to be here with the IFNLP community as they forge a new pathway into the world of NLP that invites in collaboration, education, and support as we all grow as practitioners and humans. So I want to say a special thank you to Simon for inviting me to share this journey and for welcoming me back into the fold. I'm truly excited to see how we can bring an elevated view of NLP to the forefront that focuses on learning, growth, and development.